efforts. So without further ado, I would like now to hand over to Nicolas, who will be sharing with us some information about the main issues related to supply chains in Africa and the dynamic that have been triggered by the pandemic. Nicolas, over to you. You have exactly 10 minutes.
Okay, great. I'm going to share some slides because a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I'll get more information in. I'll expand this. Okay, great. So thank you, Taraya, and I'd also like to express my appreciation to the African Union and to IFAD for this opportunity to talk to you today. I'm going to talk about how COVID-19 has affected food supplies in Africa and supply chains. And of course, we're still in the middle of it. And so a lot of these are just preliminary results, but I think we've already gathered a fair amount of information on what's happening. Let me start off just by talking about the health angle. We have about 1.4 million cases as of yesterday, according to the statistics, and sorry, that should be 20,000 deaths. The largest number of cases have been in South Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Algeria, and Nigeria, as you can see from the red dots on this map. And the little graph down at the bottom here shows that the new cases of COVID-19 peaked in July and have dwindled since then, but it still remains an issue. There's evidence that the mortality rate in Africa seems to be lower than other regions of the country, and there are a lot of different theories for why that might be the case. But this isn't a medical or epidemiological conference, so I will leave that to the doctors. Now, because of the impact of COVID-19 on the rest of the world, Africa is obviously connected in various ways to the rest of the world, and that means that some of the impact of COVID-19 comes through these connections, through these channels with the rest of the world. First, there's been a sharp drop in international travel, which has implications for countries with significant tourism. Mauritius and Seychelles, the Seychelles have seen a very big drop in tourism, as have other countries, but these two countries are more dependent on tourism than, say, South Africa or Kenya or other countries. Second, there's been a reduction in auto and air travel, which caused a fall in oil prices, lower demand. And this obviously has benefits for oil importers, but it also hurts those that rely on exports, particularly Nigeria and Angola, as well as some others. Third effect is remittances. They are projected by the World Bank to fall 9% in 2020, down to 44 billion. And so all of these have an effect on the economies in sub-Saharan Africa. In addition, there have been export restrictions by Vietnam, Russia, the Ukraine, a number of other countries, and this has a disproportionate effect on sub-Saharan Africa because the region is a net food importer. And these percentages here represent the proportion of imports that are affected in some way by these restrictions. In other words, if you import rice from Vietnam, then you're affected by the limitations that Vietnam has put on its exports. It may have been a minor restriction, and it may have been a temporary restriction. As you can see at the bottom, there were fewer export restrictions in 2020 than in 2008 during the food price crisis. And they were also more short-lived. Most of them just lasted 4 or 5 months and have been lifted by now. There are different ways in which COVID-19 affects domestic food markets within sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, there's some direct health effect on farmers. There's lockdown and movement restrictions, which reduce access to seed and fertilizer, and also to extension services, as the previous speaker was just mentioning. Movement restrictions limit the availability of labor, particular labor that moves from one part of the country to another to satisfy labor requirements. The restrictions, like closures, for example, affect processing, transport, retailing, and trade, both international trade, but also cross-border trade, which is important in sub-Saharan Africa. The lockdowns have caused unemployment and reduced income, which in turn has an effect on food demand. And I'll come back to that topic a little bit later. But there are some regional differences. Many areas of West Africa and East Africa were planting in March and April when the COVID-19 first hit. Whereas in Southern Africa, the main harvest tends to take place at the end of the year. And so there was probably less of an effect on in Southern Africa. Just a quick look at world food prices. If you look at the red line on the left-hand side, that's for 2020. The vertical white line indicates the beginning. It represents March of 2020, so the beginning of COVID-19 crisis. As you can see, prices were falling, but have since May have increased pretty sharply. The graph on the right breaks it down. This is just 2020, but it breaks it down into different types of commodities so that you can see that cereals and dairy, cereals is the yellow line and dairy is the sort of pink line, and sugar down here at the bottom have all increased pretty sharply since the middle of the year. Within cereals, maize and wheat prices are rising, but rice prices are relatively stable. Okay, so let's look at domestic prices within the region. These are prices which African consumers actually pay and which affect the prices that farmers receive as well. These are maize prices tend to be determined by domestic supply and demand, not as influenced by international prices. You can see there's a fair amount of variation across countries. Again, the vertical line represents the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. You can see that maize prices are stable or maybe even declining a little bit in Kenya and Uganda, but rising in Ethiopia, and there isn't a graph, but in Somalia as well. If we look at other regions of Africa, I don't have time or space to cover all the prices, but just a sampling. In South Africa and in Nigeria and Senegal, we see prices rising, particularly over the last 6 months or so. And in South Africa, that probably is affected by world prices because South Africa is an exporter. So when world prices go up, then South African prices tend to go up. In Nigeria, this is more of a domestic effect. This is probably largely related to restrictions associated with COVID-19. And that's probably the same pattern in Senegal. Okay, I should mention that other countries show more stable prices. I haven't put them up here, but Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique haven't yet shown a sharp increase, partly going back to that issue of Southern Africa benefiting from not being in the middle of planting in the March-April period. In terms of COVID-19 and overall income, the IMF projects that GDP growth will fall 3 or possibly a bit more % in 2020. This means a real GDP per capita reduction of 5.3%, which takes it all the way back to the 2013 level. So it's quite a sharp increase and pretty unprecedented in the speed at which it's occurred. The movement restrictions and lockdowns have usually exempted agricultural production, but travel movement restrictions impede agricultural marketing, as I discussed before, and processing and retail trade are affected by lockdowns. This increased unemployment in the informal sector, and we see that particularly with restaurants and bars and hotels, which of course affects the nature of food demand, the composition. If we look at by sector, staple food supplies are the least affected. I wouldn't say they're unaffected, but they're probably somewhat protected by their importance to urban consumers, so that the governments have been reluctant to do anything intentionally that would jeopardize that supply. But occasionally things happen through unintended consequences. So there have been some effects. High value commodities have been more affected. The production is more vulnerable to lack of inputs or labor. Obviously, if you're marketing a perishable crop, then a roadblock or a delay has a much more serious effect. And on the demand side, lower income has shifted food demand away from high value commodities, away from meat, dairy, and fruits and vegetables, and towards staple crops like maize and millet and sorghum. If we look at food security, according to the Global Report on Food Crises, which came out just before COVID-19, they estimated that there were about 135 million people with acute food insecurity in the world. And this map shows the sort of hotspots. The same group, the Food Security Information Network, which is sort of an alliance between FAO and WFP and other organizations. They did an update in September focusing on 27 countries. They found a roughly 5% increase in the population with acute food insecurity. I should note that most of these countries are areas in conflict: Yemen, South Sudan, northeastern Nigeria, and Burkina Faso. And so these are not limited to things that are caused by COVID-19. But remember that these are just very serious cases. I think what COVID-19 has done is had a larger but less sharp effect across the entire continent, as opposed to conflict, which tends to be much more focused and a sharper effect in a few places. A very interesting set of studies being done by the World Bank using phone surveys. They're working in 6 countries, but they have published results on 4 of them: Ethiopia, Malawi, Nigeria, and Uganda. And they concluded that government action against COVID-19 was associated with more knowledge and greater adoption of precautionary measures, more knowledge of COVID-19 and more adoption of precautionary measures. Malawi, where the court struck down some of the restrictions, there was much less knowledge and less adoption of precautionary measures compared to the other 3 countries. About 3/4 of the population that they surveyed in these 4 countries experienced some loss of income, particularly non-farm income. These are small shops, wage employment, which are affected by closures and movement restrictions. And the household's ability to cope was hampered by limited access to medicine and staple foods, particularly among poor households. And then finally, they noted a pretty significant impact on education of school-age kids, that student-teacher contact dropped from 96% to 17%. In other words, at the time of the surveys, only 17% of students had sort of face-to-face interaction with teachers.
Thank you, Nicola. Yes, 30 seconds.
Okay, this is my last slide, so perfect timing. So for the future, much depends on the development and distribution of vaccines. Africa was somewhat fortunate in 2 respects. As I mentioned before, the impact on illness and mortality has been lower than other regions, And also 2020 was a relatively good year for agricultural production in spite of the constraints and limitations. So that has softened the impact of COVID-19. But of course, there's a lot of concern about whether these two trends will continue in 2021. There's also concern over the long-term impact of lost schooling, particularly if it continues into 2021. And I think COVID-19 has strengthened the arguments for effective social safety net programs. I think there's also a real need to look carefully at what types of measures do the most to reduce the spread of COVID-19, but have the smallest impact in terms of hurting income, which has indirect effects on food security. Okay, thank you. And back to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I really enjoyed your presentation, found it very nicely complementing what Sarah said, because you broke down the transmission channels, the international one through remittances, food exports and tourism, but also the local ones. And that was particularly interesting in some of the graphs showing that the price effect depends actually on the country and the commodity. So that was quite interesting. So without further ado, I would like to first thank our two keynote speakers for the very interesting interventions.